Hey everyone, it's Sarah. Tonight's story is a difficult one. It's a story I've held in my chest for years, a weight I'm finally ready to share. It begins not with my voice, but with my son's, captured on a recording that still sends a chill down my spine. I want you to hear what I heard. Close your eyes and listen. Imagine the slow, rhythmic drip of water hitting a concrete floor. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. This wasn't a scene from a horror movie. This was the reality my 10-year-old son, Leo, endured for 48 hours. I found the original video file last month while archiving old projects. The footage is raw, unsteady, filmed by a hand trembling with a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. The camera pans across a filthy basement floor in rural Pennsylvania, lingering on the rusted legs of an old furnace, before settling on a wired dog kennel tucked in the darkest corner. Inside, a single threadbare blanket. Over this image, you hear the audio I recorded when I picked him up, his small voice a ghost in my ear. He whispered, "I pretended I was an astronaut in a dark spaceship, Mommy, just waiting to go home." My son, my sweet boy, forced to sleep in a cage by his own grandparents. The reason they gave me was even more monstrous than the act itself. It all started with one job interview, a single chance I believed would finally set us free. That chance for freedom was a beacon in the bleak landscape of our lives. For 2 years following my divorce, Leo and I had been navigating life on a razor's edge in our small Pennsylvania town. The skeletons of old steel mills clawed at the gray sky, a constant monument to a bygone era of grit my parents never stopped glorifying. We lived in a cramped, second-floor apartment where I worked as a freelance graphic designer, a title that romanticized the reality of hunting for gigs and stretching every dollar until it screamed. It was a life of quiet desperation, but we had each other. My world didn't revolve around invoices and client calls. It revolved entirely around Leo. He's a gentle soul with an artist's hands, a boy who would rather spend hours sketching wildlife than play video games. But his gentle nature was housed in a fragile body. Leo has a severe anaphylactic peanut allergy. This isn't a simple intolerance. It's a life-or-death condition where a single particle of cross-contamination could be fatal. Our lives were a constant ballet of reading labels and the ever-present weight of an EpiPen in my bag. He was my son, but he was also my most profound responsibility, a precious life I had to shield from a careless world. That fire, that burning need to protect him, was the only thing keeping me going. And then, that fire was put to the test. An email landed in my inbox like a message from another universe. A prestigious design firm in Pittsburgh wanted to interview me for a senior creative role. This wasn't just another freelance gig. This was a career. It meant a steady paycheck, proper health insurance, a better school for Leo. It was our golden ticket. I had no choice but to go. But the euphoria was immediately crushed by a wave of ice-cold panic. Leo. Who would watch Leo? That left a single dreaded option. My parents, Frank and Carol. My relationship with them was a fragile tapestry of obligation and resentment. They viewed my life as a string of failures and Leo's condition as a dramatic inconvenience. But desperation forces you to play the only hand you're dealt. I spent the entire day before I left preparing. I pre-packed every single one of his meals in hermetically sealed containers. I bought 2 new EpiPens and placed them in a bright red bag, along with a laminated 3-page document detailing every emergency procedure. I walked them through it all over the phone. His reply was a dismissive grunt. For God's sake, Sarah, relax. We're not idiots. We know how to watch a kid. That grunt would echo in my nightmares for years to come. I drove the 3 hours back from Pittsburgh on a cloud of hope. I had crushed the interview. But as I turned onto the familiar cracked pavement of my parents' street, that hope began to curdle into a cold, heavy dread. The house was too quiet. I opened the front door to find my mother, Carol, polishing silverware at the dining table. "Oh, you're back early," she stated, without turning around. "He's in the living room." Leo was sitting on the couch, staring at the wall, his small frame rigid. His face was unnervingly pale. When he saw me, he didn't run into my arms. He just flinched. I knelt in front of him, and that's when he whispered the words that fractured my universe. "They made me sleep in the basement, Mommy." With the spiders, my blood turned to ice. I stood up slowly and faced my parents. "What did you do?" I choked out. My father, Frank, actually rolled his eyes. "Don't be so dramatic. This world eats soft boys for breakfast. He needs to learn some resilience." Then, my mother added the line that sealed their fate. And I couldn't risk him contaminating my kitchen with his condition. Contamination. They didn't see a grandchild. They saw a liability, a thing to be isolated. In that moment, something inside me didn't just break. It calcified into something cold, hard, and unbreakable. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shed a single tear. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I simply walked to my son, wrapped my arms around him, picked up his red bag of EpiPens and safe food, and walked out of the house. I let it click shut behind us, a sound more final than any shouted curse could ever be. The 3-hour drive home was shrouded in a heavy silence. Leo fell into a troubled sleep in the back seat. I just drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. On the outside, I was perfectly still. On the inside, a firestorm was raging. Their words echoed in my mind: grit, contamination, soft. In the crucible of that silent, furious drive, an idea began to crystallize. Arguing was futile. They only respected power and feared exposure. Fine. This wasn't going to be a quick, messy act of revenge. This was going to be a siege. That night, I didn't cry myself to sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a notepad, and I started drafting a blueprint. The first step on that blueprint was to secure my foundation. I called the Pittsburgh firm, and armed with a newfound confidence, I accepted their offer on one non-negotiable condition. The position had to be fully remote. They agreed. I had a stable income, but I didn't upgrade our lives. Every spare dollar, every ounce of energy was funneled into a secret second education. My design job paid the bills, but my nights were dedicated to my true calling. I sold my grandmother's jewelry and bought a professional camera, lighting, and sound equipment. YouTube and Skillshare became my university. I devoured tutorials on documentary filmmaking. My tiny living room transformed into a makeshift editing bay. I'd work until my eyes blurred, glancing occasionally at Leo sleeping peacefully in the next room, his safety the only motivation I needed. I started a small, anonymous channel, producing short documentaries about local injustices. I was becoming a ghost, assembling an arsenal in the shadows. For over a year, I operated in this dual reality. This stability, this quiet success, was apparently more than my parents could bear. If they couldn't control me through obligation, they would try to crush me with public shame. The smear campaign began subtly. My aunt called to say my mother was worried sick, that I was having a mental breakdown. A former classmate messaged me asking why I was exaggerating Leo's condition for attention, a narrative my father was spinning at the local diner. They painted me as an ungrateful daughter, an unstable single mother. A year ago, their words would have shattered me, but now, every lie they told was a gift. Every rumor was a data point. They thought they were writing my obituary, but they were just handing me the script for their own. I had grown accustomed to the low-grade hum of their lies, believing I had become immune. I was wrong. The moment that transitioned my blueprint from paper to reality arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in an email. It was the weekly newsletter from the community church. The subject line read, "A golden anniversary, celebrating our town's finest, Frank and Carol." I clicked. There they were, beaming in a soft focus photograph. The article was a symphony of sickening hypocrisy. It lauded their 50 years of unwavering devotion and their status as moral pillars. It even included a quote from my father about the sacred duty of raising the next generation with fortitude and traditional family values. I stared at the words until they blurred. This was their masterpiece, a public monument to their virtue built on a secret foundation of a cruelty. That was it. The time for quiet observation was over. With their smiling, fraudulent faces glowing on my monitor, I picked up my phone. I pitched my voice to sound fragile and full of regret. "Mom?" I began. "I'm so sorry. I've been thinking. Can I come over for dinner on Saturday? I just want to talk." My mother's condescending acceptance was immediate. "Of course, dear. Our door is always open." Saturday night. The stage was set. I spent 48 hours transforming my small apartment into an evidence trap. 4 micro cameras were nested into their new homes. A sensitive microphone was taped to the underside of the table. They arrived precisely at 7, carrying a cheap bottle of wine and an aura of supreme victory. I committed to the role of my life. As we sat down to eat, I let the silence hang before looking up, my eyes glistening with manufactured tears. "I've been thinking so much," I began. "Maybe you were right. Maybe I am too soft." It was the validation they craved. My father launched into a self-righteous monologue. "It's about resilience, Sarah. A little hardship, a night in the basement, it forges a man." My mother chimed in, and frankly, the hygiene risk, we had to be practical. They admitted it all, believing they were lecturing their defeated daughter. My own heart was a wild drum against my ribs, but my smile never faltered. I let them bask in their victory for a few more minutes. When my father started on a rant about how kids today are coddled, I decided it was time. I slowly placed my fork down on my plate. I looked up, and the mask of the broken daughter dissolved. My spine straightened. The manufactured sadness in my eyes was replaced by something cold, clear, and ancient. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady and devoid of all emotion. "That's a wrap." Frank's face contorted in confusion. "A wrap? What in God's name are you talking about?" Instead of answering, I reached for the TV remote. "I'm talking about my new film," I said as I pressed the power button. The 50-inch screen mounted on the wall flickered to life. It displayed a perfect 4-quadrant split screen, each panel showing a crystal-clear live feed of our dinner table from a different angle. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. My father slammed his fists on the table. "What is this?" he bellowed. "It's the climax," I said, reaching for a thick folder and sliding it across the table. And this is the plot twist. He snatched it open. The first page was the bank's foreclosure notice for their property, dated 6 months prior. The second was the public auction receipt. And on the line for the new owner, in bold, unmistakable print, was my full legal name. You were so busy worrying about what was happening in my life, I said softly. You never even noticed the for sale sign on your own lawn. There was no explosion of anger, just the heavy, suffocating silence of total defeat. They stared at the deed in my father's trembling hand, then at their own captured faces on the television. I gave them 1 week to vacate the property they no longer owned. They were gone in 3 days, leaving under the cover of darkness like thieves. A month later, I uploaded a 22-minute film to my channel. I titled it simply The Basement, a Pennsylvania Story. I just released it. And the first few days were quiet. Then, the ripple effect began. It spread like wildfire in our town's Facebook group. The church issued a strained public apology. But then, my inbox began to fill, not with hate, but with confessions, stories from people I'd known my whole life, detailing their own secret basements, their own experiences with abuse hidden behind the veneer of traditional values. My story had become a permission slip for others to feel seen. A national podcast on generational trauma featured the film. My small, personal act of vengeance had unintentionally sparked a much larger conversation, becoming a testament for anyone who had ever been told their pain didn't matter. That was 5 years ago. And that brings us to today. The old house is gone. I sold the property, and with the money, I founded a small nonprofit arts collective for at-risk youth. On the very spot where that dark basement once sat, there's now a sun-drenched pottery studio with a garden out back where kids can create something beautiful. Just last week, Leo, now a lanky, kind-hearted 16-year-old, was sitting with me on the studio's porch. He turned to me, his expression serious. "Mom," he asked, "looking back on all of it, why did you do it that way?" I looked at my son, a young man so full of the gentle spirit the world had tried to crush, and I gave him the most honest answer I had. Your grandfather taught me that the world respects hardness. I believed him, but he was wrong. Hard things are brittle. They crack under pressure. True strength, Leo, isn't about being unbreakable. It's about having the courage to protect what's vulnerable. It's the strength to build a garden where a prison used to be. I reached for his hand. I did it to show you that your heart was never a liability. It was always the entire point.